So my name is Patrick Olive, and I am the Executive Director of PunkTorah, which is the organization under which OneShul operates, and it's wonderful to have you here. We are going to be studying the book of Noah tonight, Parshat Noach, and what we're going to do is something a little bit different than in our traditional Torah study. We're not going to read the full book of Noah. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at lots of different issues within Noah, and we're going to talk about whether or not Noah's flood really happened, and how we sort of feel about this. So, instead of reading the full text, obviously, I think a lot of people already kind of know, the Noah story. I'm going to just do this part, and if you look at the top of our website, or I should say the top of this particular room, our classroom, you'll see a link that says download the notes for tonight. If you click here, you'll be able to get these notes up. They'll also be posted tomorrow on OneShul's website. And if you have any questions, if you want to know more about Noah, if there's anything that's confusing you, feel free to interrupt. This is not a sit back and relax type of TV show. This is a real interactive religious community. So, I will go ahead and get started with the reading. So this is Noah in a nutshell. So God instructs Noah, the only righteous man in a world consumed by violence and corruption, to build a large wooden ark. A great deluge, a great flood, says God, will wipe out all life from the face of the earth, but the ark will float upon the water, sheltering Noah and his family, and 2 members, male and female, of each animal species. Rain falls for 40 days and nights, and the water churns for 150 days more before calming and receding. The ark settles at Mount Ararat, and from its window Noah dispatches a raven, and then a series of doves, to see if the waters were abated from the face of the earth. When the ground dries up completely, exactly 1 solar year after the onset of the flood, God commands Noah to exit the ark and repopulate the earth. Noah built an altar and offers sacrifices to God. God swears never again to destroy all of mankind because of their deeds, and sets a rainbow as a testimony of his new covenant with man. God also commands Noah regarding the sacredness of life. Murder is deemed a capital offense, and while man is permitted to eat the meat of animals, he is forbidden to eat flesh or blood taken from a living animal. Noah plants a vineyard and becomes drunk on its produce. 2 of Noah's sons, Shem and Japheth, are blessed for covering their father's nakedness, while his 3rd son, Ham, is cursed for taking advantage of him. And the story concludes with the Tower of Babel and the generations before Abraham. So, that is the story in as quick of a nutshell as possible. And, I think for the most part people know the Noah story, so really no sense in going through and reading the entire thing word for word. So, a few key points. So the world, it says, has become a terrible place because people have abandoned all sense of goodness. As it says here, and the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that, and this is my own italics, every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So that's kind of a roundabout way of saying that basically people were evil constantly, and they were so evil in their minds that they never had a good thought. Every moment of every person's day revolved around evil thoughts. So it also says that the earth was violent and corrupt, but it's because people couldn't imagine goodness. The Bible takes for granted the idea that how we think relates to how we act. So this is really interesting because psychologists call this cognitive behavioral. So it's this idea that the things that we do, the things that we think influence what we do. Every great religion teaches that you are what you think. And so this is a truism that exists in Jewish spirituality, and it exists in all kinds of religions. Buddhism, to a certain degree, has kind of gained the monopoly on this idea, but it's an idea that all great religions seem to share in common. Now, it says that Noah was a righteous man. So the exact word for righteous that's used is zadik. Zadik comes from the word tzedakah. The word tzedakah means justice. So, pop quiz for anyone who is in the chat room right now. What is tzedakah? What does tzedakah traditionally mean? Or in what context have you heard in Jewish life of tzedakah? Okay, so yes, the answer is justice and righteousness and charity. So typically with tzedakah, we think of a tzedakah box. So if you go into a Jewish home, you will see a little coin box, and it's traditional that you put your change in, or whatever the case is, and then you take that money and you give it to charity. So the idea of tzedakah sort of was translated colloquially into charity, but that's actually not right. It has to do with justice and righteousness. So what made Noah a tzaddik was the fact that he felt a sense of need to live a just life. In this case, what justice has to do with is the idea of obligation. And this is where the idea of charity versus righteousness are different. Charity is something you do out of the goodness of your heart. It's sort of going beyond. It's something that you do, because maybe you're emotionally connected to something. So you're watching Feed the Children or Save the Animals or something like that, and you think, okay, I'm going to do a charitable act. A tzaddik isn't doing a charitable act. Instead, what they do is they realize the importance of righteousness and justice, and they believe that they are commanded and will obey the commandment, the mitzvah, of creating a just world. So what's interesting about why God would have picked Noah out of all of these people, it wasn't just because he was a nice guy. It was because he was willing to live in accordance with obligation. Tzedakah is an obligation. It is something you are required to do. Charity is not something that you are required to do. So we know this because in Genesis 6:11 it reads, "Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he." So Noah, God knows Noah's temperament. It says here that Noah saw God gave grace to Noah. He was able to look into Noah's mind and see that Noah was not like the rest of humanity, that he had positive thoughts, that his thoughts weren't constantly set on evil. So Noah gained God's favor. And God knew that Noah would live out whatever God needed him to do, because he had a sense of obeying this particular commandment of righteousness, which is why he is called a tzaddik. Now let's talk about the ark itself. So the ark, if you look at the number of cubits, would have been about the size of the Titanic or some other huge sort of ship line type of thing. To give you a perspective of what a cubit is, it's about the length of a man's arm. So you think of the number of cubits and you build it out and you get a gigantic vessel. Now here's what's interesting about that. It says that Noah was commanded by God to make the boat entirely out of wood. So it's gopher wood is the type of wood that he would have used. Here's the issue though. You have a global flood, you have water coming down, you have water coming up, the atmosphere is permeating with water. And what's going to happen if you have a vessel entirely made out of wood is that when it is sitting on the water, it is going to break, and it is going to pop leaks everywhere, and it will sink. There's no way that a boat the size of the Titanic, made entirely out of wood, would have been able to survive the water. So what this means is that the whole idea of looking to the ark and the way it was designed, and maybe God gave Noah this special knowledge of how to build something that would have survived in this sort of feat of ancient science, it's not true at all. There's no way you can make the argument that God gave Noah, based on these measurements, any kind of superior technological knowledge that would have made the ark survive, if it's true that it was made entirely out of wood. It literally would be impossible. So the whole idea of looking to the Torah literally and saying, oh, well, Noah had this advanced knowledge. This is something that you find, it's the idea of the ancient technology. So there's ideas like, the pyramids were built by aliens and sort of things like that people believe. This idea that in the past people had revelations of huge kinds of technology, great technologies. This wouldn't have been true at all if the ark was built entirely out of wood. So if you want to look at it from a miracle standpoint, it really would have been that the ark was protected by God. So God would have made sure that the ark did not collapse the way that science says that it would have. Now it says that Noah put clean and unclean animals on the ark. So that's Genesis 7:2-3. So how could there be clean and unclean animals prior to the idea of kosher? So where we see clean and unclean has to deal with animals that are suitable to eat. So unless you're already looking at the notes and you are sort of having a cheat sheet, does anyone want to make a suggestion as to where this clean and unclean business could have come from? There's lots of different answers, but I've included three basic answers to this. So does anyone know where this clean, unclean thing would have come from? And like I said, there's a lot of different answers. A lot of people propose different things, but I've kind of included the top three ideas in my notes here. So I'll give you a minute to think about it. And if no one knows, then I will just move on. Just hit the cheat sheet. Okay, looks like everyone's already looked at the cheat sheet. So, possible reasons why this clean versus unclean thing would have come from. So the first is that the Noah story was written during the Babylonian exile. And the story would have naturally included kashrut, because kashrut was part of the lifestyle that people led during this time, this biblical kashrut. So when this story was written down, it would have made sense that they would have said clean and unclean animals. That would have helped to act as foreshadowing from a literary standpoint for the Mosaic text regarding kosher dietary laws. A second possibility is that it had to deal with ritual sacrifice. So when when the waters recede, Noah's ark lands on Mount Ararat. The first thing that Noah does is he builds a temple, or he builds an altar rather, and he offers a sacrifice. So he would have had some kind of animal that would have been related to the sacrifice in some way. Now the third possibility, and this is a very extreme kind of outsider idea, is that Noah is the original holder of the Torah, and that the Torah was passed on from Noah through to the patriarchs, and that at some point the Torah would have been either lost or not codified until the time of Moses and Mount Sinai. So this is a very outsider opinion, but it's one that has been speculated before. As a matter of fact, I know a conservative rabbi that likes to teach that as an interesting midrashic, legendary interpretation. And where that comes from is sort of the proof text for that is the idea in Parshat Toldot, which is the Jacob and Esau story. So Jacob was, or excuse me, Esau was the hunter. He was Isaac. So Isaac. So it starts Abraham, Isaac, and then you have Jacob and Esau, and they're the brothers. Okay. So Esau was this hairy beast of a man. He was a hunter. Jacob, it says, dwelled in tents. So he was sort of more of a scholarly kind of guy. He was more of an indoorsy kind of guy. He would be kind of a brainiac, would maybe be the term we would use now, maybe a little bit of a quiet, more passive type. And so Rashi said that the term, Rashi was a great scholar and biblical commentator, a great rabbi. He said that the term dwelled in tents. What he was talking about, what the Torah talks about, is that the tents were the tents of study, and that Jacob was actually studying the Torah. So there's an idea that the Torah has existed since the time of Noah, and that it was passed on that way. Another aspect of it is the fact that the book of Deuteronomy is said to have been a lost book, that it was found much later. So there's this stream within Judaism of this idea that there are texts that have been passed on that we didn't know about, that there were times when texts were forgotten, ideas were forgotten, and that this is just another example. Now, that's a very outsider type of opinion, but it's an opinion nonetheless. Okay. Now, what's interesting about the idea of the world in the flood is that it's basically the same idea as the world during creation. So you have darkness, you have chaos, you have the idea of a firmament, which is the ring basically around the earth that would have been sort of like water vapor, basically a halo of water. What we're dealing with is an earth that's being dialed back to an earlier time. That basically Noah is surviving the recreation of the world, and that the story is talking about that the flood time is basically just a retelling of the creation story. Now, an important thing that's interesting about when it talks about a worldwide flood, this is where language gets interesting. So there's two words basically. There's more, but we'll use the two most common for earth. Okay, one is ha'eretz. Ha means the, eretz means land. Okay, and then you have the word olam, which is also used for world. Olam does not mean land, however. Olam means world, but it means world in the context of community. It means in the context of different tribes, and basically Olam world is civilization. So you think of, in Judaism, we have the term the world to come, Olam haba, the world of the future. That's the messianic world. It's a world where the lion lays down with the lamb, and tikkun olam means to repair the world. Olam haba, the world of the future, where we have this messianic age where we're all at peace with one another. The term, though, that the biblical writers used in the Noah story is eretz, and eretz means land. So when you're talking about Noah's flood, you're not talking about a flood of the world in an olam context. You're talking about a flood of the land. Now, land can mean world, but it's important to know that the world concept that's being discussed here is one that really is just about a physical land. You have to remember, these people believed that the earth was flat. So if you were a person living back during this time and you heard about a great flood that destroyed all of the people of the land of Ha'eretz, you would have just naturally looked at it as, okay, Eretz, the world around me, is whatever I can see. It's the horizon in the front, horizon to the side, back and forth. That would have been your concept of world. They're not talking about olam, they're not talking about this big picture world, they're talking about a world that is tied to the land. It is the destruction of the land that is around you. So I personally see this as a refuting of a global flood, which is how we typically look at it. It's how evangelical Christians look at it. I think that it's more correct to say that it was a land flood, that it was a local flood. But nonetheless, it was a flood that destroyed the world as those people understood it. I use the example of Katrina. Katrina was not a worldwide flood. It was a flood, however, of ha'eretz, of the land. And if you were stuck in Katrina and you were on top of your roof and all you could see is water to your left and water to your right, and it's completely rising above the roof and is about to destroy everything that you have and you're going to die, that is a worldwide flood for you because your world is that particular space. So in that sense, the idea of the Noah story being a worldwide flood is true. You know, they're talking about the world as those people would have understood it. It just doesn't mean that the waters rose above the Himalayan mountains. It's a completely different concept. And certainly there are people who would argue with me, you know, the idea of Eretz can mean world, but it doesn't quite mean world in that same context. And so we have a question here. At that point, that could indicate both flood of the world as earth and the world as community. You know, I mean, it could. I mean, certainly the idea behind the global flood or the worldwide flood was that it destroyed all of the people. That was really what God wanted to destroy. God wanted to destroy all the evil people. And absolutely, you're saying that Katrina hit a community, so it could be seen in a communal context. Absolutely, I agree with that. All I'm saying is that in terms of the linguistics of the Hebrews, it would have been understood a little bit differently than how we understand it now. Absolutely, would I say that Katrina was the hit a community? Of course. It's just that they don't use the word olam, they use the word ha'eretz. So they were trying to discuss something that was land-based instead of something that was bigger, more metaphorical, which is how olam is used. Okay, so we fast forward through the rest of the story. We have an interesting point where Noah gets drunk. So Noah, we're told, is involved in the husbandry of the vineyard. So he is a grape grower, he's a winemaker. So he sacrifices an animal on top of Mount Ararat, and he immediately begins to grow a new vineyard. So Noah decides to celebrate. He gets drunk, and he nakedly is wandering through his vineyard. Now, two of his sons cover him up, but Ham, it says, uncovered his nakedness. Now, there's a lot of different ways that's been interpreted. I'm going to give you my interpretation of it. I don't believe that uncovered means that he was physically uncovered. So we know that Noah was already naked, and we know this because Ham sees him and sees him naked, goes to his brothers, and his brothers cover him up. And then in the morning, Noah then curses Canaan, who is the son of Ham. Okay? So what I interpret this to mean is that it means that Ham saw his naked father, told his brothers about it, that Ham was basically immodest, and that he sort of maybe made fun of his drunk father, or maybe he should have just left his father alone. The other sons, out of respect, covered their father, but they did it with their heads turned. Sometimes it's interpreted as their backs turned. So the idea is that Ham tells his brothers, the brothers find the father, and they cover him in the most modest way possible. So I tend to interpret it that the brothers were trying to do something redemptive to their dad by covering him up. Ham instead is exposing the father. He's exposing him as a drunk. He's, perhaps that's his way of making fun of him, or whatever the case is. We kind of have to read between the lines a little bit on that one. But that's my understanding of it, because it makes a point in the text that the brothers covered their naked father up with their backs, their heads turned. Now, why would Canaan, who was the son of Ham. So Ham is the son of Noah. He's the one that did the uncovering. Why would Noah then, in his hungover stupor, decide to curse Canaan? I think that this is actually allegorical. That what it's talking about is that in this time when the Noah story is being written, there was a lot of interest in the idea of the book of Joshua, the telling of sort of brave epic stories. This is because we were in Babylon, we were in captivity, and so a lot of the stories that are going to come out of that kind of place are ones of triumph. So what is a big triumph story in the Bible? It's Israel going into Canaan and decimating it and taking it over. So this idea of the sons of Israel, which is Japheth and Shem, overpowering Canaan, I think is a literary foreshadowing of the book of Joshua, and that's where that comes from. So I don't personally see it as, oh, Noah was so immoral, and then he curses the son of the son as opposed to his son for doing something bad. Why did he do that? So I think that's really what that's about. That's supposed to be understood as sort of a almost political advertisement for the Israelites. The idea that ever since the time of Noah, we have had the ability to take over Canaan. That Canaan, it actually says that Canaan would be the slave to Israel. And so I think that that's where that comes from. That's actually a political statement and not meant to be a statement about what does it mean to be truly righteous. Now, one thing that's interesting about the book of Noah is that we're really talking about two different flood stories that have been connected together. And this is where we really get into some interesting biblical scholarship. So the first, there's an older story and a newer story. So the older story is found in a couple of places in Genesis, and the newer flood story is found in a couple of other places. And then you had these editors, which, if you believe in the documentary hypothesis, which is the current understanding of how the Bible was put together, you had editors, and these editors in scholarship are called redactors. So what they did is they basically cut and paste different stories together and created one single story out of multiple sources. You have to remember that storytelling back then was mostly oral, and then you had a select group of scribes. The scribes would have been the most educated elite, whereas the rest of the population that's telling oral stories and passing on knowledge is going to be doing it just through storytelling. They're not going to be telling it through books. So you have these different stories, these different versions, and the sense of biblical scholars today is that you have two different stories. The older flood story is sort of Egyptian in its influence. The newer flood story seems to be a little bit more Babylonian in its influence, and that would make sense because this story came together in Babylon. So sort of a cross comparison between the different stories. So the first, and this is the big one, is that in the old flood story, God is Yud-He-Vav-He. God is Adonai. God is the name that we do not speak. God is the name that Moses, in the Moses story, understood God to be. The newer flood story is the word Elohim. And you can see a sort of back and forth ping-ponging of the different names for God in this way. So that's how we sort of know that there's two different texts going on here that have been put together. You have two different names for God, and they're sort of spliced together in different ways. In the old flood story, human wickedness is what prompts God to wipe out the descendants of Adam and all of the other creatures, but not sea creatures. Now, in the newer story, Elohim wipes out everything. In the old story, there's no details given about the size of the ark. In the new flood story, we have knowledge of what the ark looked like and how it should be built. In the old flood story, Noah is instructed to take 7 pairs of edible animals on board and 1 pair of unclean animals. In the newer story, Noah is instructed to take 1 pair of all animals. And that newer version is the one that tends to be in pop culture, the idea of all the animals 2 by 2. But it's really two different ideas there. In the old story, the flood is a simple matter of basically being too much rain, and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, 40 days and 40 nights doesn't necessarily mean a literal 40 days and a literal 40 nights. That can also mean a very long time, or enough time, or long enough. An example of how this exists, this idea of a number of days really just meaning a lot of time, it's kind of like how we would say, I've got a million things on my mind. Well, do you really have a million things on your mind? No, you just have a lot on your mind. Or I'm overwhelmed by the hundreds of things that I have to do. An interesting parallel in Middle Eastern culture, the Muslim idea of the afterlife and the idea of the 72 virgins, that's an Arab euphemism for plentiness, as something being plentiful, in the same way that 40 days and 40 nights would be plentiful as well. So it's interesting from a language standpoint. They're not necessarily talking about 40 literal days. It's just a way of saying long enough. Now that's the old story, and it basically is it has more to do with the rain than that particular aspect. But in the old story, it's raining and raining and raining, and that's what creates the flood. Now in the newer story, it's raining, but also water is coming up from the deep. So it's the idea that rain is actually, or that water is coming up from the ground like geysers. So in the old story, the ark lands in an unknown location, and in the newer story, you have the Mount Ararat. And then this is where it really gets to be interesting. So in the old story, Noah has a covenant with God, and he builds an altar, and he kills the edible species. So that's where the idea of the ritually clean animals come from. But what's interesting in the new story is that there is no altar. That's not the way it works. So does that have any significance? Well, I believe it does. The older story came from a time when people were building their own temples. They were building their own sacrificial spots. They would go on top of mountains and make sacrifices and burn animals and things like that. So during temple times, and during the idea of the United Kingdom, you had a push by the monarchy and by the temple priesthood to get rid of these sort of propped up altars. There was too much diversity, they felt. One of the best ways that monarchies try to unite people is through united religion. A great example is the Church of England, the Catholic Church. Look at the Inquisition during Ferdinand and Isabella's reign of Spain. The Inquisition was meant to destroy all other religions. So this is something that monarchies do. They try to unite all people under one religion, because if everyone is practicing one religion and you can pick one social place that is going to be representative of all people, why not a religious institution? So, of course, in the new story, you wouldn't have this concept of all of these little altars. It would have been much better to have a story where this sort of thing doesn't happen, because what people will say is, oh, well, Noah was building these little altars, and now the United Monarchy is trying to destroy our altars. So that's why that story was not a part of sort of the state-funded, for lack of a better word, state-sanctioned version of the Noah tale. So there's a hypothesis that the Noah story excuse me, is actually a Sumerian story. And where this comes from, there is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest pieces of literature found. There's another story, however, which predates Gilgamesh, and it's the story of Ziusudra. And this this idea of Ziusudra, this is a Sumerian story. It's a deluge story. It's a flood story, and it goes a little bit something like this. Ziusudra reigned for 10 years as the king of Shuruppak, which is a Sumerian city which was on the Euphrates River. This is basically modern-day Iraq. It's about 100 and some odd miles south of Baghdad. Floods were a common phenomenon in this time. In fact, it was the only way that trade barges could get on the river. So if you imagine a boat, think about when you're a little kid and you have a creek and you take your boat out there, but the boat's too big and the water's too low and you sit in it, you're going to be stuck. The water's not going to push you. So what was required was for the waters to rise enough that the weight of the boat could fit in the water and then float. So it would have been common to wait until the waters rise. You would then put your barge on there, you would go down the Euphrates River, and this was a way of creating trade. This is what levees are about. So it's the idea of the raising and lowering of water for trade to go through. We still have this to this day. Now, in the summertime, about June of 2900 BCE, if you're not familiar with the term BCE, BCE is the more commonly accepted term for before Christ. It actually means before the Common Era. This is the term that is used by Jewish scholars and is now used by all scholars today. So 2900 BCE, during the annual rising of the Euphrates River, a 6-day thunderstorm caused the river to rise about 22 feet higher, and it overflowed the levees. Now, by the time that the river began to rise, it was already too late to evacuate the foothills of the mountains, which were 110 miles away. So Ziusudra, this king, boarded one of the barges, and it could have been his barge, it could have been something that he commandeered, that was already loaded with cargo, and the cargo would have been things like beer and grain and animals. And he boarded this, and he floated down the Euphrates River, and the only issue that he had was when he was floating down in the Euphrates, he assumed he would stay there, but the water was the storm was so bad that he actually wound up in the Persian Gulf. And he finally grounded in an estuary at the mouth of the river. Now, some people say that he could have landed in modern-day Bahrain. It's another option as well. Now, once he was there, once he was in wherever it was that he finally landed, he offered a sacrifice to a Sumerian god on the top of an altar of a temple ziggurat. So a ziggurat is kind of like a pyramid, basically. It's an artificial hill. So scribes in Babylon, remember the stories being written in Babylon, during the expulsion of the Israelites would have found this story, and they would have understood it as being similar to a story that already circulated among Israelites. So Near Eastern people shared a lot of the same myths, but these myths were a little bit different depending on the type of community that you belong to and its particular religion. And this story would have been codified in the Torah. So there's archaeological and geological evidence for some kind of flood like this. We're pretty sure that this flood basically did happen, that it would have happened for maybe 7 days, 6 days, something like that. We have the Ziusudra story, we have the later Gilgamesh story, we have the Noah story. All of these stories tell basically the same thing. Once upon a time, a terrible flood happened. A man got on a boat with his animals and his family and survived. And then some sort of sacrifice is made as a result of that. So this story already exists and people are already believing this, and this is where this would have come from. Now, I have another sort of theory behind this. I think that not only would people have been inclined towards this story, but also I think that they would have noticed something interesting in their geological surroundings. We know what parts of the world were once underwater, what parts were desert, what parts were tropical, etc., etc., and we know this because of fossils. So I have a theory that part of what makes these flood stories popular in certain areas is that people would have seen fossils. They would have seen shells, they would have seen other things that reminded them of lakes and rivers and oceans, and they would have seen them in mountainous areas and hill areas and pastoral areas, and it wouldn't have made sense. It wouldn't have made sense that in the mountain there's evidence of shell life, of nautical life. That wouldn't have made any sense at all. So these deluge stories already exist. They're based on some kind of historical truth, and then you see these fossils, and you think, well, obviously this great deluge happened, because we have this fossil evidence to show it. And what's interesting today is that you have biblical archaeologists, not people who are particularly scholarly, I'm talking more about evangelical creationist type of individuals, who make that same argument to this day. That, well, Noah's flood clearly happened because we found a fish fossil in a mountainous area, so clearly that's the case. Now, if you look at the scientific perspective, it has more to do with the fact that climates changed over time. Plate tectonics is another issue. There's a lot of reasons why certain areas changed over time. Some places were underwater and then rose up. This, of course, happened over millions of years as opposed to 365 days. So it's a little bit different. But I would say that it's fair that early peoples, particularly because the land would have looked very different back then than it did now, that ancient peoples would have seen fossils and would have had these stories and would have interpreted those fossils in terms of mythology. This idea is called the ancient paleontologist hypothesis. And I think that in this case it could be true. Now there are some people who take this idea into all kinds of different levels. As an example, there's people that say that early people would have seen dinosaur bones and thought that they were dragons. They would have seen large, femur bones and things like that of dinosaurs and thought that they were giants, things like that. So, there's already sort of a train of thought with that. I don't know about that, but I do think that there is some truth to the idea that ancient peoples would have seen fossil evidence of waters and places that it didn't make sense, and it would have helped to uphold the theory that a global flood happened. And we know that some kind of flood happened during this time anyway, and we have the stories to back it up, so it's pretty interesting. So, if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend, first of all, downloading those notes. They're in the top of the chat room right now, or excuse me, they're in top of the classroom right now. They'll also be posted on the OneShul site tomorrow. If you go on YouTube, someone has uploaded a great documentary that was on the BBC. It was Noah's Ark. The link to that is actually in this document that I've posted. It's the first link under sources. I also recommend, if you're interested in the difference between Eretz and Ha'olam, if you look at Parshat Noah, the 1918 translation is on a website called mechonmamre.org. Chabad obviously has great stuff, Partners in Torah, and then ort.org, so ort.org. They have a great website, bible.ort.org, and they have some great stuff. You can see transliterated Hebrew text from the Bible. So you can look at the Hebrew words and then look at the transliteration, and it will help you to see some of these linguistic differences. Where it says Elohim as opposed to Adonai, and you can see which is an older text and a newer text and how they were glued together. It's really interesting. So if you enjoyed this class, I hope that you'll support OneShul's free online library, which is where we're going to be posting this, and all of our classes, by making a suggested minimum $5 donation. And I will include the link one more time to where you can make that donation via PayPal. You can also send in a check if you would prefer to do that. If you are watching this video after the fact, if you weren't with us live, then you can go to the top of the OneShul website. There's a little icon of a credit card. You can click on that, and then that will help you to find whichever way to donate that you would like. But, you know, I appreciate you being here. I'll take a few questions if anyone's interested. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes. If anyone's asking questions, quick announcement, we will have a 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time prayer service. That's 7 a.m. Western, or Pacific, I should say. And then Friday, Ketzira will be leading the Shabbat service. So that will be at 7 Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday. So tomorrow, Tuesday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, morning prayer service. We will also be saying Kaddish, and then we will have Ketzira's service on Friday at 7 p.m. So, unless there's any questions, we will go on ahead and wrap this up. And I appreciate you being here. And tell your friends, please, again, volunteer, donate. There's a lot of different ways that you can get involved. If you'd like to see classes like this continue, we all volunteer, we all participate in different ways, and it would be just terrific if you could help out as well. So, all right, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for coming here, and I will see you tomorrow morning, Tuesday, at 10 a.m. Eastern for Shachris, or Friday for Shabbat. So, thank you very much. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.